He thought it was just another afternoon by the river, just a boy with a fishing pole and a stubborn line caught in the current. But when Ethan Miller dragged a rusted box from the mud, the quiet town changed forever. Inside lay names tied to vanished lives, photographs warped by time, and a pistol no one dared claim. Within hours, police swarmed, then federal agents. What could have been buried so deep for so long that the river itself was chosen as its vault? And why did it resurface only when a 12-year-old pulled it free? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The river wound through the Vermont countryside like an old scar, shallow in places where children waded in summer, deep and slow in others where the current kept secrets. Ethan Miller liked the quiet stretches, the ones few people bothered with. At 12, he had found more peace along the water than in the noisy streets of town or the cramped rooms of his family's small rental. He would set out after school with a tackle box dented at the corners, a fishing pole older than him, and a pocket full of flat stones chosen for skipping. The water never judged him. It didn't care if he caught anything. It was enough that it moved, steady and patient, the way he wished the rest of life did. That afternoon, the sky was low and heavy, a blanket of gray that pressed down on the valley. The air smelled of wet soil and pine. Ethan perched on the riverbank, boots dug into the mud, concentrating on the way his line cut through the surface. He had cast 3 times already, pulling in nothing but tangled weeds and waterlogged sticks, but he didn't mind. The rhythm of casting and reeling in, the little whistle of line through the air, was enough to make him feel like he was exactly where he belonged. When the tug came, he almost didn't notice. The current often played tricks, nudging the line as if something unseen toyed with him. But this pull was different, heavier, more stubborn. The rod bent in a sharp arc, and Ethan braced his boots deeper into the mud, digging in with a grunt. Whatever he had hooked, it wasn't going to come easily. He imagined for a moment it might be the kind of fish people bragged about at the general store, a pike as long as his arm, something he could carry home like a trophy. But the fight didn't feel alive. It felt dead weight, solid and unmoving, as if the river itself had decided to anchor him. Hand over hand, he worked the line back, teeth clenched, every muscle in his thin frame straining. At last, something broke the surface. Not a fish, not driftwood. It was a box, metal square, and ugly with rust. Water poured from its seams as it bobbed against the pull of the line. Ethan's breath caught. He staggered backward, dragging it inch by inch onto shore until mud gave way beneath its weight. The box clanged against a rock, heavy enough to jar his arms. Its surface was mottled with barnacles and river scum, the kind of corrosion that spoke of years, maybe decades, beneath water. One side was dented inward, another etched with faint scratches that could have been writing once, but had nearly vanished under layers of rust. A smell rose from it, sharp and metallic, mixing with the wet earth. Ethan crouched beside it, heart still racing from the effort. His fingers hovered above the surface, but didn't quite touch. There was something unsettling about the way it had come up, as if the river had been waiting for him, and only him, to pull it free. He brushed away a clump of weeds clinging to its side, revealing the faint outline of a symbol he couldn't identify. Not a manufacturer's mark. Something older. For several minutes, he just stared. The river moved on, indifferent, lapping against its banks. Birds shifted in the trees above, restless in the gathering wind. Ethan wiped his palms on his jeans and sat back on his heels. The box was too heavy for him to carry far, but he felt an odd responsibility for it now, like finding a message in a bottle, except this message was sealed in steel and rust, locked away for a reason no one had told him. He wondered what could be inside. Coins? Tools? Old war relics? Stories sometimes floated through town of things lost during the floods decades ago. Trunks of valuables swept away when bridges collapsed. Even a farmer who had vanished one spring and was never seen again. People laughed when they told them, but the river never laughed. The river kept what was given until it chose to give it back. Ethan leaned closer, trying to peer through the crust of corrosion around the lid. The hinges looked fused, welded by years underwater. There was no easy way to open it, at least not with bare hands. His breath fogged in the cool air as he whispered to himself, "What are you?" The sound of his own voice startled him. It made the moment feel real, not just a game of imagination. He glanced up and down the riverbank, half expecting someone to appear and take it from him. But he was alone. Only the water and the trees stood witness. The box sat in the mud, patient and silent, as if waiting for him to decide what to do next. Ethan knew one thing for certain. Whatever was inside had been meant to stay hidden, and now that it was in the open, nothing would be the same. The box did not make sense. Ethan had pulled plenty of things from the river before, branches, scraps of metal, once even a hubcap, but nothing that felt like this. It was no larger than a shoebox, yet it had taken every ounce of his strength to drag it up from the mud. Sitting there on the bank, slick with algae and dripping river water, it seemed to carry a weight beyond what its size should allow. He tried to nudge it with the toe of his boot and felt resistance that made his legs ache. It was as though the thing was rooted in place, unwilling to be moved, clinging to secrets the river had guarded for too long. He crouched low, squinting against the fading light. The dented sides showed deep grooves where something hard must have struck it years ago. Barnacles clustered in patches, their shells brittle from being wrenched out of water. Along the top edge, he thought he could make out a line of letters, but the rust and grime had swallowed them. His heart thumped harder the longer he stared. Something about the object felt older than it had any right to be, as though it belonged to a story already half forgotten. Ethan knew he couldn't be the only one to see it. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed the one person who would believe him without question. Liam answered on the second ring, his voice crackling with the background noise of television and his younger siblings. "You better not be calling me about another fish that got away," Liam said. "It's not a fish," Ethan told him quickly. "I found something. By the river. You need to come." "What is it?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, glancing at the box again. "But it's heavy, too heavy, and it's got markings. Just come, okay?" There was a pause, then the sound of Liam shouting something to his mom before the line went dead. Ethan slid the phone back into his pocket and sat on the grass, eyes never leaving the strange object. The river hissed behind him, moving on as if it had nothing left to do with what it had given up. Liam arrived 20 minutes later on his bike, tires crunching over the gravel path. He dropped the bike carelessly and came running, his usual grin fading when he saw Ethan's face. "What did you drag out this time?" he asked, brushing sweat from his forehead. Ethan stepped aside, and Liam's eyes widened. "No way." He crouched down, running his fingers just above the surface without touching. "That looks military, like something from the army. Look at the shape. It's a case." "You think so?" Ethan asked. "I've seen stuff like this in my uncle's garage," Liam said, his voice lower now, edged with awe. "He's got an old ammo box. This looks almost the same, only older, way older." They both leaned closer. Liam pulled a stick from the ground and began scraping carefully at the rust, each stroke revealing tiny glimpses of what lay beneath. The rough surface gave way reluctantly, as though it resented their curiosity. After several minutes, faint outlines began to emerge. Ethan saw the curve of letters, some recognizable, others worn down to shadows. "E-U-S," Liam murmured, squinting. "Or maybe it's F. The rest is too far gone." He scraped again and caught the edge of a symbol, an emblem, etched shallowly into the metal. It looked like an eagle, wings spread, though half it was erased by corrosion. Ethan's skin prickled. "That's not just some box. That's official, like government official." "Yeah," Liam said, sitting back on his heels. "It's not something people just lose." If this was in the river all this time, he didn't finish the thought. The boys exchanged a glance. The air between them felt heavier than the box itself. Ethan imagined soldiers carrying it, decades ago, through mud or across borders. He wondered if someone had meant to hide it, if it had been thrown into the water, not to be found again. What if there's something inside? Liam asked, voice hushed now, like the woods themselves might be listening. Ethan swallowed. The idea had already been circling in his head. He thought about opening it right there, about prying the lid until it gave, but something in the way Liam stared at the emblem made him hesitate. Whatever this was, it was bigger than two boys on a riverbank. Liam tapped the side with his stick, the hollow clang echoing faintly. It's sealed tight. We need tools. The sky had darkened further, clouds heavy with the promise of rain. The shadows made the box look darker still, as though it absorbed the little light left. Ethan pushed his palms against his knees and stood. We can't just leave it here. We're not carrying that thing home, Liam shot back. You saw how heavy it is. But we can figure something out. Tomorrow, bring something to scrape it clean, maybe even pry it open. Ethan nodded, though unease lingered in his chest. The emblem, the letters, the weight, it all felt wrong, like a piece of history had washed into their lives without permission. As the boys stood over the box, the river kept moving, whispering against the rocks, carrying on as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Yet both of them knew the truth. The box had chosen this moment to surface, and now it was theirs to face. The next afternoon, the boys met at Ethan's house, the rusty box still hidden behind a pile of brush where they had left it. Neither had slept much. Ethan had lain awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of cars on the highway, his mind returning again and again to the weight of the box and the faint emblem scratched into its surface. He had told himself it was probably nothing, scrap metal, an old toolbox lost in a flood years ago, but the way Liam's eyes had widened convinced him otherwise. By morning, curiosity had drowned out fear. They raided Ethan's father's shed, the air inside heavy with the smell of motor oil and sawdust. A row of rusting tools hung neatly on hooks above the workbench. Liam picked up a crowbar, too heavy for his small frame, and set it down with a grunt. We'll never get this past your dad, he muttered. Ethan dug deeper, finally pulling out a long screwdriver with a flat, sturdy end. It fit neatly in his hand, not too big, not too small. He slipped it into his backpack alongside an old hammer, and they slipped out before Ethan's father came back from his shift at the mill. At the riverbank, the box waited, unmoved, half sunk in damp earth. Liam brushed away leaves that had already gathered around it, muttering, "Looks meaner in daylight." Ethan set the box upright, the metal scraping against rock. He pulled the screwdriver free and pressed the tip against the seam of the lid. The metal squealed faintly but did not budge. Liam crouched beside him, holding the box steady. Push harder. Ethan leaned his weight onto the tool. The hinge groaned, a low metallic protest that sent a shiver down both their spines. He tried again, this time striking the screwdriver handle with a hammer. A dull clang echoed over the water. Something shifted, but only slightly. Rust and barnacle dust sprinkled down, catching the sunlight in sharp motes. "It doesn't want to open," Ethan muttered, sweat dampening his forehead. "Then make it," Liam replied, his voice unsteady but determined. They worked together, hammering and prying at different angles. Each strike rang louder than it should have, as if the river itself listened. At last, one hinge gave way with a violent snap. The lid lurched but stayed fastened on the other side, clinging stubbornly to its decades of silence. Ethan gritted his teeth, wedged the screwdriver deeper, and twisted with every ounce of strength his arms could summon. The hinge shrieked like an injured animal and finally surrendered. The lid cracked open, reluctant, groaning on its tortured edge. The smell that rose from inside was sharp and sour, a mix of oil, mildew, and something metallic that neither boy could name. They leaned back, breathing through their shirts, blinking against the sting in their eyes. For a long moment, neither reached inside. The contents lay wrapped in oil-soaked cloth, dark and stiff with age. The fabric had preserved its secrets, but only barely. Patches had rotted away, exposing glimpses of metal edges, the corner of something wooden and the faint glimmer of brass. Ethan extended a hand, then pulled it back. What if it's dangerous? Liam swallowed and nudged the bundle with a stick. The cloth shifted with a crunch, like dry paper. Dangerous doesn't sit in the mud for 50 years. It's just old. Together, they lifted the first bundle. The cloth cracked open, revealing a pistol, its surface mottled with rust but unmistakable in shape. Both boys froze. Neither had ever held a real gun before. The weight of it, even decayed, carried an authority that silenced them. "Put it back," Ethan whispered. But Liam's eyes were wide with fascination. It's history, maybe from the war. He placed it carefully aside and reached for the second object. This one was lighter. The cloth peeled away to reveal a small wooden box, edges scorched, its lid sliding open easily. Inside were yellowed photographs, men in uniform, their faces stern, standing beside vehicles marked with numbers. Another photo showed a group around a table, maps spread wide, expressions tense, as if caught mid-argument. Ethan turned them over. None had names written on the back. The last bundle was the strangest. Heavy, rectangular, it clinked when moved. They tore the cloth slowly, revealing a leather-bound ledger. Its pages were swollen from moisture but still legible, filled with columns of names, dates, and numbers written in a tight, careful hand. Some entries were crossed out in red ink. Others carried symbols neither boy understood, triangles, circles, lines intersecting like codes. Ethan and Liam exchanged glances. Neither spoke. The river rushed on, carrying with it the sound of their discovery. They had expected junk, maybe coins or tools. What they found instead felt deliberate, dangerous even, as though the box had been locked and weighted down for reasons far greater than rust or time. Ethan closed the ledger with shaking hands. We shouldn't have opened it. Liam, still staring at the pistol lying in the grass, whispered back, "Then why does it feel like it was waiting for us?" The objects lay scattered on the grass like pieces of a puzzle. They were never meant to solve. The pistol caught the light in places where the rust hadn't eaten through, its barrel dark and heavy, a reminder of violence that felt far older than either of them could understand. The photographs curled at the edges, their sepia tones blurred by water damage, but still sharp enough to reveal faces. Men in uniforms, men in suits, some standing proudly, others caught in moments of fatigue. They looked out of another world, one that had not expected to be remembered. The ledger rested near the box, its cover warped but intact, the smell of leather and damp paper rising every time one of them turned a page. Ethan flipped through carefully, his fingertips brushing over the neat, cramped handwriting. Names filled the pages, each one accompanied by dates and numbers written like coordinates or accounts. Some lines had symbols beside them, circles, slashes, triangles. Others had been crossed out in thick strokes of red ink that bled through to the other side. He didn't recognize a single name, yet the sheer number of them unsettled him. It wasn't the kind of book people kept for personal memories. It looked official, cold, and deliberate. Liam leaned over his shoulder, eyes wide. "It's a list," he whispered, his voice hushed as if the woods might overhear. "But a list of what?" Ethan shook his head, closing the book too quickly. "Doesn't matter. We shouldn't even be looking at it." "Come on," Liam protested, picking up one of the photographs. "This is real, like evidence or something. People are in here. People who lived in this town, maybe." He studied the image, pointing to a man with a faint scar across his cheek. "What if someone knows who this is? Then they'll know we took it." Ethan shot back. His nerves were frayed. The pistol sat too close, its hollow barrel aimed nowhere, but still feeling like it stared at them. He wanted to push it back into the box, seal the lid, and throw it into the river again. Liam's excitement grew the longer he stared at the contents. "Don't you get it? We found something important. This isn't trash. This is history. Maybe even treasure. People could pay for this. Or they'd come looking for us," Ethan said, his voice sharp. He glanced around the clearing, half expecting men in dark suits to step from the trees. The idea of keeping something like this felt dangerous in ways he couldn't explain. "This is like finding old coins. There's a gun in here, Liam. A real gun. What if it was used for something bad?" Liam hesitated, but didn't let go of the photograph. "So what? It's old. Nobody cares now." Ethan stared at him, frustration tightening in his chest. "How do you know that? What if these names mean something? What if this ledger is connected to crimes? People go to jail for this kind of stuff." The argument stretched between them. The quiet of the riverbank suddenly loud with every rustle of leaves. Ethan could hear his own pulse in his ears. Faster now, stronger. The responsibility of the box weighed on him as heavily as the metal had when he first dragged it from the current. He imagined police sirens, imagined headlines about boys meddling in things they didn't understand. Liam finally dropped the photo back onto the grass. His eyes were still bright, though alive with possibility. If we tell someone, they'll take it away. And then what? We'll never know what was inside. They'll lock it up in some vault, and nobody will care that we found it. Maybe that's how it should be, Ethan said quietly. He crouched and began folding the cloth back over the pistol, wrapping it until it disappeared. His hands shook, but the action steadied his breathing. We're not supposed to have this. It belongs to someone else, or it used to. Either way, it's not ours. Liam opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. The river moved behind them, steady, unconcerned with their debate. For a long while, neither spoke. The photographs fluttered in the breeze, edges tapping against the grass like restless fingers. Ethan tucked the ledger back into the box and pressed the lid down as far as it would go. He didn't care that the hinges were bent, that the seal wasn't complete. He only wanted it closed. "We can't tell my dad," he said firmly. "He'll call the sheriff. And once the sheriff knows, it's out of our hands. So we just bury it?" Liam asked, half mocking, half serious. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. His voice broke on the words. "But if we keep it, something bad's gonna happen. I can feel it." Liam looked at the box, then at Ethan, and for the first time his grin faded entirely. The weight of what they had uncovered pressed down on both of them. It wasn't treasure. It wasn't junk. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong in their hands. And yet here it was, waiting for a decision neither of them was ready to make. The box didn't stay hidden for long. Ethan had carried it home with Liam's help, both of them staggering under its weight as they tried to look casual on the back road that led to his house. They hadn't thought about what to say if anyone saw them, and luck was the only thing that kept curious eyes from asking questions. By the time they reached the small shed behind the Miller home, sweat streaked their faces, and Ethan's arms trembled with the strain. They shoved the box under a stack of tarps, whispering promises to figure out what to do later. Liam left before dinner, reluctant but still buzzing with ideas about secrets and treasure. Ethan lingered, glancing out the window every few minutes, as though someone might appear in the yard to claim what he had taken. It was Maya who found it. She was 16, 2 years older than him, and sharper in ways he both admired and resented. She noticed everything. When Ethan lied about homework, when their father came home later than usual, when the cupboard food stretched thinner than it should have, that evening. While Ethan tried to distract himself with a game in the living room, Maya slipped out to the shed to look for an old notebook she had left on the workbench. She spotted the tarps piled awkwardly, corners bent where Ethan's hurried hands hadn't smoothed them down. She pulled them back, expecting maybe a broken tool or a hidden stash of candy. Instead, the rusted box sat there, its lid poorly forced shut, edges jagged from their prying. She knelt, fingertips brushing the cold metal, and felt the wrongness of it immediately. The river smell clung to it, damp and sharp. Curious, she tried to lift the lid, but the bent hinges resisted. The edge gaped just enough to show the corner of the leather ledger, its pages swollen and stained. She froze. Whatever this was, it wasn't something her brother should be dragging home. Inside, Ethan was startled when the back door slammed. Maya stormed in, eyes blazing. "What is that thing in the shed?" she demanded. Ethan's stomach dropped. He fumbled for words, cheeks flushing. It's nothing. Something I found by the river." "That's not nothing," she shot back. "There's a gun in there, Ethan. I saw it, and papers, and photographs. What are you thinking bringing that here?" His voice cracked as he tried to defend himself. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just leave it. What if it got washed away again?" Before he could stop her, Maya marched into the kitchen where their father was rinsing the dinner dishes. "Dad, you need to see what Ethan dragged home," she said firmly, no trace of hesitation. Their father, Daniel Miller, looked up, weary from a 12-hour shift at the mill. He was a man of few words, his strength worn thin by years of raising 2 children alone, but there was steel in his gaze. "What is it?" he asked, wiping his hands. Maya didn't wait. She led him out to the shed, Ethan trailing behind with dread curling in his stomach. Daniel bent over the box, his brow furrowing deeper with each second. He tugged at the lid, managed to force it open far enough to glimpse the pistol wrapped in oil-soaked cloth, the ledger, the photographs. He didn't need more. His face hardened, the kind of expression Ethan had only seen when bills came due and there wasn't enough money to cover them. "This is dangerous," Daniel said flatly, turning to his son. "You never should have touched it." Ethan's protest tumbled out in a rush. "It's not dangerous. It's just old stuff. Me and Liam, we were curious. We want to know what it was. That's all." Daniel shook his head. "Curiosity doesn't explain away a gun and documents like these. This isn't kids' business. It could be evidence, Ethan. Evidence from something serious." "I can take care of it," Ethan pleaded, voice breaking. "We don't have to tell anyone. Please, Dad, don't." But Daniel was already pulling his phone from his pocket. His thumb hovered over the sheriff's number, and when Ethan saw it, panic welled up. "No, if you call them, they'll take it all away. We found it. It's ours. Ours." Daniel snapped, his patience fraying. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you could be in just for touching this? If this is connected to a crime, and it looks like it might be, keeping it secret could ruin our lives. I won't risk that." The call connected after 2 rings. Ethan stood there, fists clenched, his protest drowned beneath his father's steady voice as he explained to the sheriff what they had discovered. Words like weapon, documents, and evidence hung in the air, heavy and final. When Daniel ended the call, silence filled the shed. Ethan felt hollow, like the box had stolen something from him the moment he pulled it out of the river. Maya stood beside their father, arms crossed, her expression stern but tinged with worry. She hadn't done this to punish him, he realized. She had done it because she was afraid. "They'll be here soon," Daniel said quietly. "Go inside, both of you. Let me handle it." Ethan wanted to argue, to shout that it wasn't fair, that he had been the one to find it. Instead, he lowered his head and walked back into the house, the sound of the river still echoing in his ears. The secret he thought he could keep had slipped away, and now it belonged to someone else. The wail of sirens broke the evening calm long before patrol cars came into view. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, hands clenched around a glass of water he hadn't touched. Maya stood near the window, peering through the curtains as red and blue lights reflected off the trees at the edge of their yard. Their father didn't speak. He had taken a seat in the living room, arms folded, his jaw set in a way that told Ethan arguing further would be useless. Gravel crunched as the first car pulled into the driveway, then another behind it. Uniformed officers stepped out quickly, their movements precise, purposeful. Ethan's heart thudded as one of them knocked on the door. Daniel rose, opened it, and ushered them inside with the heavy calm of a man who knew once you invited law into your house, nothing would remain the same. "The box is in the shed," Daniel said. His voice carried no hesitation, though his eyes betrayed the fatigue of the choice he had made. The officers nodded, their boots leaving faint marks on the floor as they crossed the back door. Ethan followed at a distance, his stomach tight. The cool night air pressed in as the group stepped outside. The shed stood in the wash of headlights, its shadow stretched across the yard. When the door creaked open, the smell of damp metal escaped as the river had followed the box into hiding. One officer crouched, lifting the tarp. The box sat waiting, heavy and silent. He tried to move it and grunted at the unexpected weight. "Definitely not empty," he muttered, signaling to his partner. Together, they hauled it out into the open, careful not to tilt it too far. The sound of metal shifting inside made Ethan flinch. Radios crackled as the discovery was reported. Code words passed between the officers in clipped tones Ethan didn't understand. Within minutes, more cars arrived, engines rumbling, tires hissing over gravel. Flashlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the yard. Neighbors had already begun to gather along the fence line, their silhouettes lit in flashes of red and blue. The sheriff arrived last. Sheriff Collins was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, his hat pulled low against the rising wind. He didn't waste words on greetings. His eyes fixed on the box immediately, and he knelt beside it with the practiced caution of someone who had seen too many things left behind where they didn't belong. When the lid was pried open enough to show the pistol, wrapped but unmistakable, his expression hardened. He pulled on gloves before touching anything, lifting the edge of the ledger with careful fingers. He glanced at a page, frowned to columns of names and numbers, then closed it again as though the sight alone carried weight. "Get this area taped off," he said sharply. His deputies moved quickly, stringing yellow tape around the shed and yard, the bright plastic fluttering under the headlights. What had been a quiet family property turned, in moments, into the perimeter of a crime scene. Ethan stood frozen by the porch steps. The river secret no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the sheriff, to the radios, to the flashing lights that turned night into an endless cycle of color. Maya lingered near him, arms wrapped tightly across her chest, while their father spoke in low tones with Collins near the patrol car. One of the officers began photographing the box from every angle, the camera shutter clicking steadily. Another logged details into a clipboard, his handwriting precise and hurried. The pistol was lifted out first, placed into a clear evidence bag. The photographs followed, each one carefully handled, faces and uniforms preserved under plastic. When the ledger was sealed away, Ethan felt as if something had been stolen from him, even though he had never understood it to begin with. Collins turned back to Daniel, his voice raised just enough for Ethan to catch fragments. Words like evidence, long time buried, and federal jurisdiction reached his ears. The sheriff's tone carried no doubt. This was bigger than their town, bigger than anything Ethan or Liam had imagined while prying to hinges with a screwdriver. More cars arrived, unmarked this time. Men and women in plain clothes stepped out, their clipped introductions drowned by the radios and murmuring neighbors. They spoke with the sheriff in quiet, tense voices, pointing to the box, to the shed, to the dark line of the river beyond the trees. Ethan shifted on his feet, his chest tight with a mixture of fear and regret. This had been his discovery, his secret. Now it was buried beneath procedures and tape, owned by people who spoke in codes and carried authority he could never match. Maya touched his arm gently, grounding him in the chaos. The sheriff gave one last order, his voice carrying over the hum of engines. "Secure the property. Nobody in or out until we're finished here." Ethan watched as strangers moved across his backyard with purpose, every step marking the end of the small world he had known. The box that had once been just a heavy curiosity now carried the power to change everything, and the adults treated it with a kind of caution reserved for things that could not be undone. The riverbank that had always been a place of calm was unrecognizable by the following morning. Where Ethan once cast lines into current and skipped stones across its surface, yellow tape now fluttered between trees and fence posts, marking the place as forbidden. Patrol cars idled at odd angles along the dirt road, their light bars dark, but their presence unmistakable. The smell of wet mud mixed with exhaust as officers paced the ground, their boots leaving fresh tracks on soil that had always been left to deer and fishermen. A pair of deputies moved slowly along the water's edge, raking the sand with poles, their eyes alert for any glint of metal. Another officer crouched low, brushing leaves aside and placing small orange flags wherever he found something worth noting, an old bottle here, a scrap of rusted metal there. Nothing was ignored. What had been a boy's secret discovery was now treated as evidence. Every inch of the bank combed and cataloged as if the river itself were on trial. Ethan stood behind the tape with Maya and their father, the weight of eyes pressing against his back. Neighbors had gathered, drawn by the sight of police cars and the murmurs that travel faster than truth. Families leaned on the hoods of their trucks, whispering in low tones. Some pointed toward Ethan, their voices carrying just enough for him to catch the word boy, followed by fragments he couldn't make out. He felt heat rise in his cheeks, not from pride but from the suffocating realization that he was no longer just Ethan Miller, the kid who spent too much time by the river. He was a boy who had found something that made police swarm the town. Maya kept her arms crossed, eyes sharp as she scanned the crowd. Their father said little, his face locked into the same stern mask he had worn since the sheriff arrived the night before. Every so often, Sheriff Collins would glance in their direction, as if to make sure the family stayed put. The sheriff had explained that what was found might have connections beyond the town, that until they understood exactly what they were dealing with, everything had to be preserved. His tone had left no space for argument. A reporter from the local paper slipped through the crowd, notebook in hand, her questions firing toward the sheriff. Collins deflected with short answers. Ongoing investigation. Possible historical significance. No comment at this time. His refusal only fed the curiosity. Ethan caught the look on the reporter's face, the way her eyes lingered on him when she realized he was the one who had pulled the box from the water. He turned away quickly, wishing he could vanish into the trees. The officers carried the box itself down to the river's edge, setting it on a tarp spread carefully over the ground. Gloved hands examined its seams, its battered lid, every dent and scrape recorded in photographs. The pistol, ledger, and photographs were already sealed in bags, placed in the hard cases waiting in the trunk of an unmarked vehicle. Ethan felt a hollow ache in his stomach, watching them handle the things he had once held with his own hands. It had taken him only minutes to pull the box from the water, but it now belonged to a world of forms, signatures, and evidence tags. Voices in the crowd swelled whenever an officer carried something new into sight. Some neighbors whispered about hidden treasure, others about bodies lost in the river years ago. Old men shook their heads knowingly, recalling floods and unsolved disappearances. One woman muttered about gang activity, her words spilling out with the authority of rumor. Nobody knew the truth, but the truth mattered less than the story forming in their minds. A boy had pulled something from the river that had been meant to stay buried. The scene dragged on for hours. The morning sun climbed high, casting light on the tape that fluttered like a warning flag. The river glistened as though mocking the intrusion, continuing its steady path as if it had never given up its secret at all. By noon, the sheriff ordered additional tape to be strung across the far side of the bank, extending the perimeter. Deputies moved along the road, asking neighbors to step back. Still, the whispers followed Ethan, carried in half-heard fragments: ledger, gun, government. Maya touched his shoulder lightly, her expression soft for the first time in days. "They're going to talk no matter what," she murmured. "Doesn't mean they know anything." Ethan nodded but couldn't answer. His chest felt heavy, a mix of shame and confusion. He had wanted to uncover something important, maybe even exciting. Now the excitement was gone, replaced by the weight of strangers in uniforms turning his quiet river into a crime scene. The yellow tape snapped in the wind, its sound sharp as if it were cutting the place in half. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan realized the riverbank would never feel the same again. What had once been his refuge was now crowded with officers, neighbors, and secrets too large for him to carry. The river had given him the box, but it was the world beyond that had claimed it. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, the scene by the river had taken on an even stranger air. The red and blue flashes of the patrol cars had grown dull against the creeping dark, their beams replaced by harsh floodlights set up on tripods. The quiet hum of the river was drowned out by the steady crackle of radios, the bark of orders, and the shuffle of boots through mud. Ethan watched from behind the yellow tape, his body aching from standing all day, yet he refused to go home. It felt wrong to leave, as if the river would take back what it had given once his back was turned. Headlights swept across the road, cutting through the haze of dust stirred by too many cars. A convoy of black SUVs rolled in, tires crunching over gravel in perfect unison. Doors opened almost before the engine stopped. Men and women in plain suits stepped out with precision that reminded Ethan of a drill. They were not like the deputies, who shuffled tiredly and muttered to one another. These newcomers moved with purpose, crisp and efficient, their eyes sharp even in the failing light. Badges flashed in the glow of headlights. The sheriff, who had until now commanded every corner of the riverbank, stepped forward to meet them. Ethan couldn't hear all of what was said, but he could see the shift in posture. The way Collins's broad shoulders stiffened, the way his jaw tightened before he finally gave a curt nod. Authority had passed hands, silent and absolute. The federal agents fanned out across the taped-off area, speaking into radios clipped to their collars. They opened heavy black cases filled with supplies, gloves, evidence bags, metal boxes lined with foam. Every item that had been pulled from the river was handled again, photographed with brighter lights, then sealed and labeled with codes Ethan couldn't begin to understand. The pistol was lifted as though it might still fire. The photographs were spread across a clean white board, their water-damaged faces illuminated under a portable lamp. The ledger, swollen with damp pages, was flipped through page by page, each turn recorded by a camera clicking steadily nearby. Ethan pressed closer to the tape, his breath fogging in the cool night air. The more the agents touched the items, the further away they seemed from him. Hours ago, those things had lain in the mud at his feet, their weight tugging against his hands as he pried open the box. He had felt like a discoverer, someone stumbling into history. Now he was nothing more than an onlooker, pushed to the edges while strangers in suits treated his find like a specimen under glass. Maya stood beside him, her arms drawn tight against the evening chill. She glanced at her brother's face and seemed to read his thoughts. "It's not yours anymore," she whispered. "It never was." Her words stung, though Ethan knew they were true. Still, part of him wanted to shout, to tell the men in suits that he had been the one to drag the box from the river, that he had been the one to crack it open and breathe in its damp, metallic air. Without him, none of this would exist in their world. But he said nothing. He only watched. The sheriff moved past them once, his expression unreadable. He paused as if considering whether to speak, then kept walking. Ethan wondered if Collins felt the same emptiness he did. The sudden loss of control, the realization that what had once belonged to the small town now belonged to something much larger, colder, and unreachable. The neighbors thinned out as the night deepened, some pulled away by their families, others by the creeping unease of the federal presence. But the agents remained, their floodlights burning bright against the dark trees, their voices clipped and professional. Boxes were sealed, labeled, and stacked in the trunks of the waiting SUVs. Ethan felt each closure like a door shutting. The gun sealed away, gone. The ledger boxed up, gone. The photographs placed in protective sleeves, gone. Even the rusted metal case itself was lifted and slid into a crate, its bent hinges creaking one last protest before disappearing from sight. When the final SUV was shut and locked, the lead agent exchanged a few last words with Collins. Papers were signed, radios clicked, and then, as smoothly as they had arrived, the convoy pulled away into the darkness. The sound of engines faded, leaving only the hum of the river and the low murmur of the remaining deputies packing up their gear. Ethan stayed rooted to the spot, staring at the empty tarp where the box had sat. His discovery had been swallowed whole, absorbed into a machine far beyond his reach. He felt small, insignificant, as though the river had never given him anything at all. Only the memory remained. The pull of the line, the struggle on the bank, the lid groaning open to reveal secrets. Everything else had been taken, leaving him with nothing but the knowledge that some things, once uncovered, no longer belonged to those who find them. The ride to the station was quiet, broken only by the soft of tires over asphalt and the occasional crackle of the radio. Ethan sat in the back seat of the unmarked car, his hands folded tight in his lap. An agent in a dark suit sat beside him, offering no conversation, only the faint presence of someone watching without speaking. His parents had followed in another car, his father's face unreadable through the windshield, his mother's hand resting on the seat beside him. Maya had wanted to come, but the sheriff had told her firmly to stay home. When they arrived, Ethan was led through a side entrance rather than the front lobby. The hallways smelled of coffee and disinfectant, the linoleum floors reflecting the buzz of overhead lights. A door opened into a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a recording device already waiting. The agent motioned for him to sit. The walls felt close, painted in muted gray, the kind of color chosen to keep people calm or at least quiet. Another agent entered, this one carrying a thin folder. She smiled faintly, as though trying to put him at ease, and spoke in a voice that sounded practiced but kind. "We just need to ask you a few questions, Ethan. Nothing to be nervous about. We just want to understand what happened." He nodded, his throat dry, his fingers twisted together under the table. The first questions were simple. When had he gone to the river? How often did he spend time there? He answered as best he could, his voice small but steady. Then they moved to the discovery. He explained how his fishing line had snagged, how he had dragged the box to shore. He described the weight of it, the rust, the strange markings. Every word was recorded, every pause noted. "Did you open the box yourself?" one of them asked. "Yes," Ethan admitted. "Me and Liam. We used a screwdriver." "What did you see inside?" He hesitated, remembering the pistol, the photographs, the ledger. There was a gun. Old. Some papers, too. Pictures. And a book with names. "Who is Liam?" "My friend," Ethan said quickly. "He was with me when I opened it." They asked for Liam's full name, his address, how long Ethan had known him. Ethan answered, though the weight of guilt pressed harder with each detail. He imagined Liam sitting at his own table, being asked the same questions, his excitement about the discovery replaced by the same unease that filled Ethan now. The agents never raised their voices. They never accused. They only circled back, rephrasing questions, watching carefully as if his answers contained something more than he realized. Each time he repeated himself, the memory of the river grew sharper, the sound of the lid groaning open, the smell of oil-soaked cloth, the sight of photographs warped by water. After nearly an hour, the questions slowed. One of the agents closed the folder and offered him a small smile. You did the right thing by telling someone. These kinds of discoveries can be complicated. Ethan wanted to ask what they meant. He wanted to know why the ledger mattered, why the photographs were sealed so carefully, why they treated the pistol as though it still carried danger after so many years. But each time he opened his mouth, the words stalled. The air in the room was heavy with things left unsaid. When they finally walked him out, his parents were waiting in a lobby with chairs bolted to the floor. His mother pulled him into a hug immediately, her arms tense with worry. His father spoke with one of the agents a few feet away, his voice low, his face grave. What's going on? Ethan heard his mother ask. What does any of this mean? The agent's answer was quiet but firm. It's a sensitive matter. That's all we can say right now. His mother frowned, but she didn't push further. His father nodded once, the same way he did when bills arrived in the mail, as though acknowledging a weight he couldn't change. They left through the same side door, the night air cooler than Ethan remembered. He climbed into the back seat again, the shadows of the station stretching across the lot. The drive home was as silent as the drive there, except now Ethan's mind churned with questions that had no answers. Why had the box been in the river? Who had written the names in the ledger? Why were the photographs guarded like secrets too sharp to touch? No one offered explanations. No one told him more than what he already knew. The box had passed out of his hands, and with it, so had the truth. All that remained was a memory of rusted hinges breaking open and the feeling that he had pulled something from the water that was never meant to see daylight again. The ledger haunted Ethan long after he left the station. He could still see it in his mind. The warped leather cover, the pages swollen from years in the water, the neat, compact handwriting that seemed too deliberate to be casual. He hadn't been allowed more than a glimpse, but that glimpse was enough to know it was no ordinary notebook. Back home, the house felt different. The yard still bore faint ruts from the patrol cars, and the shed door hung crooked after so many people had gone in and out. The ordinary rhythm of the Miller household had been replaced with something uneasy, a silence heavy with secrets too big for their walls. Ethan wasn't meant to know more. The agent spoke in low tones when they came and went, offering polite smiles but no real information. His parents kept their questions quiet, as though afraid to push too far. Still, Ethan listened. He listened from the top of the stairs when his father spoke with the sheriff in the kitchen. He listened from the back porch when the agents thought the kids were asleep. What he heard made his skin prickle. One evening, when the floodlights still glared against the riverbank and the hum of generators carried through the night, Ethan caught part of a conversation between two agents standing near their car. They spoke with the careful words of people who knew they were being overheard. But even the fragments were enough. The ledger contained names, hundreds of them, some tied to cases that had never been solved. The agent spoke of missing persons, their trails gone cold decades ago. They mentioned men with long criminal histories, names that had once filled police reports but had since disappeared into silence. Another time, Ethan heard his father's voice low with disbelief as the sheriff told him the ledger might connect to more than one jurisdiction, more than one kind of crime. The book was not local, not limited to their small Vermont town. It stretched outward, reaching into places Ethan had never seen, binding together lives and stories in a way that felt deliberate, orchestrated. His father asked questions, but the sheriff only repeated that the matter was now federal, that the best thing the family could do was step back and let the professionals handle it. For Ethan, that was impossible. The ledger had belonged to him once. If only for a moment, he had touched its damp pages, felt the weight of the ink. The knowledge that it carried names connected to disappearances and crimes made him restless. Each time he walked through town, he wondered if some of the faces he passed were tied, in some way, to the book. Old men who lingered by the store, women who glanced too quickly away, even the photographs on the bulletin board at the post office. He imagined all of them whispering toward the ledger, demanding recognition. At school, he caught snippets of rumor among his classmates. Someone claimed the ledger held names of war criminals. Another insisted it listed buried treasure, mapped in codes. Some said it was just a hoax, that the police were pretending it mattered to cover their own mistakes. Ethan said nothing. He sat quietly at his desk, his pencil idle, the voices around him little more than noise. He knew the truth was stranger than any rumor. The ledger mattered because it connected the forgotten. Maya was the only one who dared to speak to him about it directly. Late at night, when the rest of the house was still, she slipped into his room and sat on the edge of his bed. "I heard Dad talking," she admitted in a whisper. "They said some of the names match people who went missing before we were even born." She paused, looking at him closely. "You know what that means, right? This isn't just about us. It's about something bigger, something that's been hidden for years." Ethan stared at the ceiling, the weight of her words pressing down. He didn't need her to explain further. He had felt it from the start, from the moment the line tugged and the box surfaced in the current. The river had not given him a random object. It had given him a key, one he was never meant to hold. He lay awake long after Maya slipped back to her room. He thought of the crossed-out names in red ink, the strange symbols scrawled in the margins. He thought of the ledger sitting now in some evidence locker, guarded by men who spoke in clipped tones and carried secrets in their silence. Each page, each line, represented a life once lived, a thread pulled from the fabric of time and tucked into the dark. What chilled him most was the thought that the ledger was incomplete. If one box had surfaced, how many more still lay beneath the river's surface, sealed by rust, waiting for a current strong enough to release them? The questions circled in his mind endlessly, answers always out of reach. The only certainty was this: what he found was no accident, and the names written in that book would not stay silent forever. The river that had always been Ethan's refuge was no longer his own. Where he once heard only the lapping of water against rocks and the soft calls of birds, he now heard engines rumbling, voices carried on radios, and the metallic clatter of equipment being hauled to the shore. The agents had returned, this time not just with floodlights and clipboards, but with an entire team outfitted in heavy wetsuits and oxygen tanks. Their presence transformed the familiar bend in the river into something that looked less like a quiet fishing spot and more like a military operation. Ethan watched from behind the line of tape, his shoes planted in damp soil, his arms folded across his chest. He wasn't alone. Half the town had drifted to the scene, curiosity outweighing whatever business they should have been tending to. Mothers with strollers, men in flannel jackets, teenagers whispering conspiracies. All stood waiting to see what else the river might surrender. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the entire town leaned forward, listening. The first diver entered the water with deliberate movements, the black surface breaking around him as bubbles rose in steady bursts. Another followed, then another, each sinking beneath the current until only their air tanks gleamed faintly in the sun. The crowd grew silent as minutes passed. Ethan held his breath without realizing it, his imagination already racing. He pictured more boxes, more ledgers, more relics wrapped in oilcloth. He also imagined darker things, bones sealed away, evidence of acts too heavy for anyone his age to name aloud. When the first diver resurfaced, he raised a hand, signaling to the team on shore. Ropes were thrown, pulleys tightened, and slowly a shape emerged from the river's grip. Another metal box broke the surface, water streaming from its seams, barnacles clinging to its sides. It was larger than the one Ethan had found, dented in places, yet unmistakably similar. The men on shore dragged it onto a waiting tarp, the ground squelching under its weight. The crowd murmured, voices low and restless. Hours later, a second container was pulled up, then a third. Each came up heavy, sealed tight, scarred by decades underwater. Some were small, no larger than a toolbox. Others were so large they required 2 men to maneuver them onto land. Each time the pulley strained, the crowd shifted, leaning forward, as though they too carried the weight of what the river was surrendering. The agents wasted no time. They marked each container with numbers, photographed them from every angle, then loaded them carefully into waiting vehicles. None were open in public. Whatever secrets they held would remain hidden a little longer. Still, the sight of so many boxes lined up on the shore left a chill in the air. No one could mistake this for coincidence. Something had been hidden here, deliberately, methodically, a long time ago. Ethan's father stood behind him, silent, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. Maya stayed close, her gaze fixed not on the river but on the agents, as if studying their faces might reveal more than the boxes themselves. Ethan, though, couldn't look away from the water. He kept imagining what lay beneath the mud. How many more boxes still rested there, untouched? The river seemed endless in that moment, a keeper of stories too vast for him to comprehend. By the third day, the tally had grown. 11 containers had been pulled from the riverbed. Rumors swirled through town faster than the official reports could keep up. Some said the boxes were tied to organized crime, evidence dumped when investigations drew too close. Others whispered about wartime secrets, shipments hidden when officials feared raids. A few muttered about government cover-ups, their voices hushed but urgent. Every theory, no matter how wild, found eager ears. For Ethan, the truth mattered less than the feeling itself, the knowledge that had been the one to disturb it all. If his fishing line hadn't snagged that first box, perhaps the river would have kept its silence. Now, though, it seemed the current had only been waiting, biding its time until someone gave it permission to release what had been holding back. On the evening of the fourth day, as the floodlights flickered on again and the last of the crowd drifted home, Ethan lingered at the edge of the tape. The river glistened in the glow, calm as ever, but he no longer trusted it. It had shown what it could hide, and in doing so, it had changed the town forever. He felt both pride and dread coil in his chest. Pride that he had been the one to begin the unraveling, dread that it started something no one could finish. The boxes were gone, locked away in vehicles with tinted windows, driven off to places he would never see. But the river remained, whispering against its banks, carrying secrets still buried beneath its surface. Ethan knew this was not the end. The river had given more, but it had not given all. The first newspaper article appeared only 2 days after the dive team pulled the 11th box from the river. It ran on the front page of the county paper, the headline vague enough to leave room for doubt, but bold enough to stir unease. Mysterious containers retrieved from river, federal authorities investigating. The article avoided specifics, but the undertone was clear. This was no small-town curiosity anymore. Something larger had surfaced, something connected to shadows that stretched back long before Ethan was born. By the week's end, the story had spread beyond the county. Larger papers picked it up, their words sharper, their speculation heavier. One headline claimed the boxes could be linked to organized crime in the 1960s. Another suggested money laundering, smuggling, or political scandals that had been buried before they could come to light. None offered proof, but proof was less important than suggestion. The air of secrecy fed every theory, and the silence of federal agents made each one seem possible. At the diner in town, whispers carried from booth to booth. Old men who had worked the mills in the 60s leaned in close, muttering about nights when trucks rolled through town without reason. One claimed he remembered the sound of engines idling by the riverbank when he was a boy, too afraid to sneak closer, but certain the drivers weren't fishermen. Another swore he had seen crates unloaded under the cover of darkness, though he admitted no one believed him at the time. Now, those memories were dragged out and polished like coins, offered to anyone willing to listen. Ethan heard it all, whether he wanted to or not. At the grocery store, in the church parking lot, even in the narrow aisles of the hardware shop, people spoke as if the town itself had been waiting for the chance to confess what it had long suspected. Rumors tangled together until they felt like facts. A smuggling route cut through the river, trials for crimes that never reached courtrooms, names erased from records but still alive in memory. Each person claimed to know a piece, and each piece grew sharper as the weeks passed. His father dismissed most of it. "Talk," he muttered at the dinner table, shaking his head as he set down the paper. "That's all it is. People see lights by the river 50 years ago and think it must have been a crime. Could have been anything. Could have been nothing. But his voice lacked conviction. Even he could not ignore the careful way the agents avoided questions, the way the sheriff now refused interviews. Maya, on the other hand, collected every article, clipping them neatly and tucking them into a folder she hid beneath her bed. She read the rumors with fascination, piecing together patterns no one else seemed to see. Ethan sometimes caught her staring at the river from her window late at night, her brow furrowed as if the water itself might reveal the truth if she looked hard enough. For Ethan, the whispers carried a different weight. They were not stories told at a distance. They were bound to him through the simple fact that he'd been the one to bring the first box to shore. Every rumor seemed to loop back to him. Every suspicion tethered to the boy who had disturbed the river's silence. People looked at him differently now, some with curiosity, others with unease. A few treated him with the wary respect reserved for someone who had brushed against something dangerous. Late one evening, when hum of floodlights once again echoed down the road, Ethan overheard two neighbors speaking outside their trucks. Their voices were low, but carried just enough in the still air. They say the names in that book tied to men who were supposed to stand trial, cases that disappeared. Disappeared or buried? The other asked. Funny how records go missing when the right people are involved. The first man spat into the dirt. It makes you wonder how many in this town knew, how many stayed quiet. Ethan turned away, his stomach twisting. The ledger he had touched, the one with its cramped handwriting and red slashes through certain names, no longer felt like an old curiosity. It felt like a door cracked open to a history no one wanted to claim. At school, the rumors were crueler. Classmates whispered that Ethan's family must have been connected, that no one just stumbled onto something like this. One boy asked if his grandfather's name was in the ledger. Another taunted him about being the kid who dug up the mob's graveyard. He tried to ignore it, but the words stuck, heavy as stones in his chest. Still, the stories persisted. They wove through the town until they became part of its fabric, blending half-truths with memory. Organized crime, smuggling, secret trials, all became the language of the river. Whether any of it was true seemed less important than the fact that it was possible. The boxes had made possibility feel real, and reality had grown harder to separate from rumor. At night, Ethan lay awake listening to the steady rush of water through the trees, wondering how many secrets still lingered beneath its surface. The past no longer felt distant. It pressed close, whispering through newspapers and voices in diners, a presence heavier than the river itself. The first newspaper article appeared only 2 days after the dive team pulled the 11th box from the river. It ran on the front page of the county paper, the headline vague enough to leave room for doubt, but bold enough to stir unease. Mysterious containers retrieved from river, federal authorities investigating. The article avoided specifics, but the undertone was clear. This was no small-town curiosity anymore. Something larger had surfaced, something connected to shadows that stretched back long before Ethan was born. By the week's end, the story had spread beyond the county. Larger papers picked it up, their words sharper, their speculation heavier. One headline claimed the boxes could be linked to organized crime in the 1960s. Another suggested money laundering, smuggling, or political scandals that had been buried before they could come to light. None offered proof, but proof was less important than suggestion. The air of secrecy fed every theory, and the silence of federal agents made each one seem possible. At the diner in town, whispers carried from booth to booth. Old men who had worked the mills in the 60s leaned in close, muttering about nights when trucks rolled through town without reason. One claimed he remembered the sound of engines idling by the riverbank when he was a boy, too afraid to sneak closer, but certain the drivers weren't fishermen. Another swore he had seen crates unloaded under the cover of darkness, though he admitted no one believed him at the time. Now, those memories were dragged out and polished like coins, offered to anyone willing to listen. Ethan heard it all, whether he wanted to or not. At the grocery store, in the church parking lot, even in the narrow aisles of the hardware shop, people spoke as if the town itself had been waiting for the chance to confess what it had long suspected. Rumors tangled together until they felt like facts. a smuggling route cut through the river, trials for crimes that never reached courtrooms, names erased from records but still alive in memory. Each person claimed to know a piece, and each piece grew sharper as the weeks passed. His father dismissed most of it. "Talk," he muttered at the dinner table, shaking his head as he set down the paper. "That's all it is. People see lights by the river 50 years ago and think it must have been a crime. Could have been anything. Could have been nothing." But his voice lacked conviction. Even he could not ignore the careful way the agents avoided questions, the way the sheriff now refused interviews. Maya, on the other hand, collected every article, clipping them neatly and tucking them into a folder she hid beneath her bed. She read the rumors with fascination, piecing together patterns no one else seemed to see. Ethan sometimes caught her staring at the river from her window late at night, her brow furrowed as if the water itself might reveal the truth if she looked hard enough. For Ethan, the whispers carried a different weight. They were not stories told at a distance. They were bound to him through the simple fact that he'd been the one to bring the first box to shore. Every rumor seemed to loop back to him. Every suspicion tethered to the boy who had disturbed the river's silence. People looked at him differently now, some with curiosity, others with unease. A few treated him with the wary respect reserved for someone who had brushed against something dangerous. Late one evening, when hum of floodlights once again echoed down the road, Ethan overheard two neighbors speaking outside their trucks. Their voices were low but carried just enough in the still air. They say the names in that book tied to men who were supposed to stand trial, cases that disappeared. Disappeared or buried? The other asked. Funny how records go missing when the right people are involved. The first man spat into the dirt. It makes you wonder how many in this town knew, how many stayed quiet. Ethan turned away, his stomach twisting. The ledger he had touched, the one with its cramped handwriting and red slashes through certain names, no longer felt like an old curiosity. It felt like a door cracked open to a history no one wanted to claim. At school, the rumors were crueler. Classmates whispered that Ethan's family must have been connected, that no one just stumbled onto something like this. One boy asked if his grandfather's name was in the ledger. Another taunted him about being the kid who dug up the mob's graveyard. He tried to ignore it, but the words stuck, heavy as stones in his chest. Still, the stories persisted. They wove through the town until they became part of its fabric, blending half-truths with memory. Organized crime, smuggling, secret trials, all became the language of the river. Whether any of it was true seemed less important than the fact that it was possible. The boxes had made possibility feel real, and reality had grown harder to separate from rumor. At night, Ethan lay awake listening to the steady rush of water through the trees, wondering how many secrets still lingered beneath its surface. The past no longer felt distant. It pressed close, whispering through newspapers and voices in diners, a presence heavier than the river itself. The agents returned to the Miller house at dusk, their presence quieter than before, but no less heavy. They did not arrive with sirens or flashing lights this time. Instead, the black SUVs rolled to a stop with the calm certainty of people who knew they already held the upper hand. Ethan sat on the porch steps, the boards cool beneath him, listening to the steady hum of engines. He had expected answers, maybe not all of them, but something more than the endless silence that had followed since the boxes were pulled from the river. Instead, the agents carried folders tucked under their arms, their expressions polite but impenetrable. His father stood as they approached, his hand tightening around the railing before letting go. Maya lingered in the doorway, one arm crossed over her stomach, as if bracing against a blow she couldn't quite name. Ethan rose reluctantly, drawn forward by the invisible thread that tied him to the box and its contents. The river had given it to him, and though it was gone, he still felt responsible for whatever truth lay inside. One of the agents, a tall man with sharp features, began to speak. His words were rehearsed, the tone careful, chosen to calm rather than to inform. "We want to thank your family for cooperating," he said. "The items recovered are now part of a larger investigation. They've been transferred to federal custody and will be handled with the utmost care." Daniel Miller's brow furrowed. What kind of investigation? The agent's answer was smooth, practiced. "I'm afraid we can't share those details at this time." What I can tell you is that your son's actions helped bring long-buried evidence into the light. That matters." Ethan's chest tightened. The words sounded like praise, but they landed hollow. He had wanted to know more, not just that the evidence was important, but why. He wanted to know who the names in the ledger belonged to, why the pistol had been hidden, what crimes those boxes had been meant to erase. Instead, all he heard was gratitude wrapped in silence. His mother spoke next, her voice softer but edged with frustration. "Is it dangerous? Should we be worried?" "No danger to your family," the agent assured. "Everything that needs to be handled will be handled." Another agent, a woman with tired eyes, stepped forward to add, "Sometimes the past surfaces when it's ready. It's best to let it stay in our care now." Maya bristled at that, muttering under her breath, "Convenient." No one answered her. Papers were signed at the kitchen table. Receipts for evidence, acknowledgments of transfer, documents stamped and filed as if the matter could be reduced to lines on a page. Ethan sat quietly in the corner, watching the way his father's hand moved stiffly across the forms. With every signature, it felt as though the last thread tying him to the box was being cut. When the agents finally left, the house was filled with a silence sharper than before. Daniel closed the door and leaned against it for a long moment. Maya broke the stillness first, her voice low and bitter. "So that's it? We just forget it happened?" Her father didn't answer. He looked at Ethan, his eyes heavy with something between pride and sorrow. "It's not ours anymore," he said finally. Ethan went upstairs without speaking. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, the memory of the box replaying in his mind. The scrape of metal against rock, the groan of the hinges, the smell of oil-soaked cloth, all of it belonged to him, yet none of it did. The box itself was locked away now, sealed in some evidence vault miles away, guarded by locks and codes he would never know. He could picture it sitting on a shelf, cataloged as just another artifact in a case too large for him to imagine. What lingered, though, was not the loss of the box, but the emptiness of unanswered questions. Who had placed it in the river? How many names in that ledger still had families waiting for closure? How many secrets had been hidden not by time, but by choice? Sleep came late, and when it did, it brought no rest. Ethan dreamed of the river, its current tugging at his legs, pulling him toward the deep. He dreamed of more boxes beneath the silt, rows of them lined like coffins, their lids sealed tight. He reached for them, but each one dissolved into darkness before he could touch it. When he woke, the sound of the river drifted faintly through the trees. It carried on as always, indifferent to what it had surrendered. The truth was gone now, sealed away with a box, locked behind doors he would never open. All that remained was the memory of the moment he had dragged it from the water, and the knowledge that some discoveries were never meant to belong to those who found them. The story of the river never really left the town. Years passed, and the lights that had once glared against the water were long gone. The tape that fluttered in the breeze had been cut down, the patrol cars driven away, the black SUVs disappeared into the distance. Yet people still spoke of it, quietly in diners, in half-remembered stories at the barbershop, in whispers traded between generations. What they remembered most was not the federal agents or the rows of boxes lifted from the mud, but the boy who had pulled the first one from the current. Ethan Miller became a name attached to a moment rather than a person. People called him the boy who dragged history to the surface, the boy who woke the river. Children repeated the tale as if it were a legend, exaggerating details until it sounded less like something that happened in their town and more like a myth told around campfires. Some claimed he had pulled treasure from the depths. Others swore he had unearthed a crime family's darkest secrets. No matter how the story bent and twisted, it always began the same way, with a boy standing at the water's edge, holding a fishing pole, when the river chose to give something back. For Ethan, growing older meant carrying that story like an invisible shadow. In high school, classmates looked at him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, as though he had been marked by the discovery. Teachers spoke to him more softly when history was discussed in class, perhaps wondering if he held pieces of knowledge no textbook could provide. By then, the details of the investigation had been sealed away, the ledger locked in a vault he would never see. But silence did not erase memory. Ethan lived with it pressed into his bones, the scrape of metal against rock, the groan of the hinges, the damp smell of the cloth wrapping things not meant for children's hands. As the years rolled forward, Ethan left town for a while. He studied, worked, traveled to places where no one had heard of the river or the boxes. Yet even there, in cities that moved too fast to notice him, the memory lingered. It returned in dreams, in sudden flashes when he saw Rust on an abandoned bridge, or when the weight of silence in a room reminded him of the agents who had thanked him without ever telling him the truth. When he returned home in his 20s, older but not yet hardened, the whispers still followed him. People stopped him at the grocery store, asking if he ever learned what was inside the boxes. Others told him stories they claimed were connected. Missing relatives, strange nights by the river, rumors that felt too old to still hold breath. Ethan learned to nod politely, to say little, to let their words pass over him. He had long since realized that the truth was no longer his to tell. But the river remained patient and steady. On quiet afternoons, he would walk to the bend where it had all begun, stand with his hands in his pockets, and watch the current move. It looked ordinary, carrying branches, reflecting sky, but he knew better. The river was a keeper, and keepers never gave without reason. He no longer asked what else it might be hiding. Some questions, he had learned, were meant to stay submerged. The townspeople continued to remember him, not as the man he grew into, but as the boy who had changed everything. Children who had not yet been born when it happened repeated his story in classrooms and on playgrounds. Tourists asked locals where the boy had fished, where the box had come up, as if the ground itself might still hold echoes. Ethan grew used to it, though each telling reminded him that the moment did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to the town, to history, to the current that had carried it forward. Late one evening, standing at the river's edge as the sky burned low with fading light, Ethan realized something he had never put into words. Some treasures were not meant to be kept. They were meant to be uncovered, to be carried from silence into memory, and then let go. The box had never been his. The ledger, the photographs, the pistol, all of it had been fragments of a story too large for him to hold. What was his, and his alone, was the moment he touched it, the moment history brushed against him like a cold hand reaching up from the water. Years later, the river still moved as it always had, indifferent to the stories laid at its banks. Ethan had changed, the town had changed, but the water carried on. And when people spoke of the boy who found the box, they weren't speaking of ownership or treasure. They were speaking of how sometimes, without warning, the past rises up to the mud, finds a pair of hands unprepared, and forces itself back into the light. That, Ethan knew, would be his place in memory, not for keeping what he had found, but for uncovering what was never meant to stay hidden.